our efforts didn't go to validate April 7, and that's something that you'll see through the talk has changed over time. But when we first started, it was, hey, let's form some people, let's do a lot of testing, let's publish it, let's get industry support behind it. And so, get this over here. And make sure things get adopted. And I think when you look across the industry, or I don't know, software developers, right? We sometimes think, or folks think, if I didn't invent it, how could it possibly be that good? And one of the things we intentionally do within the Argonaut community is, hey, we're happy to pick up other work. If we see a smart project that's out there and they're, it's useful to the members of Argonaut, we're happy to test it. We're happy to try to provide our input directly to it, promote it, and get it adopted across the industry. And so we've had some really sweet partnerships with the Smart Team, with this, Smart and FHIR app launch, Logica, and right now, kind of a new collaboration this year is the International Patient Access. We're really excited to provide some support there. What we're not a standards development activity for folks. That's a whole piece of machinery that April 7 does really well, and we're happy to plug into that. Not a separate legal activity, and we're not proprietary. I think everyone's welcome if you're doing active FHIR implementation and it relates to a project we're engaged on. We'd love to have you join us. So just this quick mix of members, good mix of technology vendors, a bunch of the EHR vendors, payer stuck in there, and some great provider organizations. I think for folks who do have these kind of industry groups, having that provider input throughout your project is critical. We have, this year, I did a lot of reach out kind of prior to kind of rolling them out to make sure that we were thinking about a particular project in the right way. And this isn't the only provider organization we connect with. These are just kind of initial members. So who is the Argonaut team? So if you see these folks around, so myself kind of played project manager role. Josh Mendel, obviously smart architect. He and Gino are from Microsoft, and incredible assets who provided tons of in-kind contribution and support to the project. Dan Gottlieb spoke on bulk data, brilliant fellow, and then Eric Haas, who writes the best FHIR implementation guides, most readable, most usable around, and so has been working with me in US Core since the beginning. All right, so where do we begin? You actually rewind back to 2013. If you ever want, some history, there was a report, the JSON report. A group of really smart scientists. I believe it was funded by, maybe it was ONC initiated and funded by the Robert Johnson Foundation and AHRQ to kind of look at the state of healthcare interoperability. A huge report, lots of recommendations. Some good, call for some interesting APIs, but then some interesting things of like a unified architecture, migrating legacy stores, some things that were maybe not a great fit to the existing environment. And so there was kind of industry reaction to that, and said, all right, we're going to have form a task force and kind of turn that report into concrete recommendations, because we agree that the promise of interoperability from prior meaningful use programs, certification programs hadn't been realized. Cost savings, quality just hadn't happened. And so a group of folks got together, and the big thing out of that task force was the call to action for APIs, and ultimately starting to point to FHIR. And shortly after that, the Argonaut Project was born. And a big part of 2015 was, does the FHIR standard have kind of conceptual, like clinical, is it going to be does that standard have enough concepts to cover kind of the existing standard? We have the continuity of care document to exchange a whole bunch of clinical information. We had this thing called the common clinical data set. We had all these different kind of like data sets, and folks said, geez, can FHIR actually cover all these things? And so there was a team of us, and I think Rick Geimer here, was sitting in the front here, participated in that effort too, to say, hey, does it cover CCDA? And because before we all went all in on FHIR with the Argonaut Project, we wanted to make sure that it had that coverage. So that was one of the first projects. And then Smart on FHIR, there's all this interest in how would we actually connect these apps to EHRs or other FHIR servers. And so there was a security audit of the Smart on FHIR framework. And I thought it was great for folks who had the keynote this morning, Alyssa McKnight say, it's not just about authentication, folks. It's about, once you have authentication, what do you actually have access to? And so that was something that came out in 2014. There are some recommendations actually directly feeded into improvement on the Smart on FHIR specification. Not long after that, ONC did something that I would say, you talk about federal agencies doing something incredibly smart. I always use the word brilliant, but that's a lot for regulation. They released their certification that included an API requirement. And the reason that was really important is ONC basically didn't say, hey, you have to implement FHIR. We were still kind of, I think the industry had coalesced around it. But the certification criteria basically said you have to implement open APIs to your EHR, and you have to document how you did it. Okay, and that let the industry explore. And I think there's some really interesting, just this like side soapbox for a moment, is there are other industry activities right now that I don't think we understand super well. I saw a few talks on prior authorization, crazy complex. There's some really neat, powerful solutions being developed for it. But it's, interesting of, do you name those solutions early, or do you let kind of say, all right, you guys have to figure out prior auth in some time frame, put some framework around it, and then let the industry sort it out. So this is a great example of, hey, let's get to work. And so ultimately, the Argonauts came together. We did some really sweet testing sprints, looking at kind of constraining FHIR, and ultimately published a spec called the Data Query Implementation Guide, which provided kind of a framework for access to key information. And then we kept rolling. 2017, we did a provider directory project. CDS Hooks is a project out in industry. I'll talk about these a little more in detail later, but CDS Hooks, so clinical decision support, Hooks had some industry momentum, and there was interest to kind of plug into there. And 4 short years, that's all it was, folks, 4 short years. We were, very excited to see, Apple get join the party and provide access to, medical records directly on your phone using the Argonaut data query guides. Care Quality picked up parts of our provider directory and their, I was going to use the word network, but their kind of frameworks. Commonwealth, I think, for folks who aren't familiar with Commonwealth, an architecture, bringing together a whole bunch of EHRs with a record locator service, did a ton of work to add, instead of doing these, let's just say, cross-document sharing, maybe some complex query orchestration. There was a big push by one of the Argonaut participants, Meditech, to start using document reference and kind of start that migration path to FHIR, and they've made a lot of progress. And then at this time, half the vendors used certified with FHIR API. So, but that's 2018. So like, what have you done for me lately? Like, that's the question that's always in my mind. Like, all right, great job. Pat yourself in the back. So what's next? So CDS Hooks became, it wasn't formalized in a ballot, and a few folks said, we got to ballot this thing. It can't just sit out there as a kind of an industry thing we adopt. Okay, so it was balloted HL7 and formalized. There was no guidance for clinical notes. I know that sounds a little crazy. How do you get the discharge summary note or a progress note out of an EHR? The base FHIR standard kind of danced around it, but didn't give any kind of explicit guidance of what the access pattern looks like, what the base requirements were. And so we held some sprints to develop that guidance. And provenance, holy cow, provenance is complex, but built some kind of baseline guidance, say, all right, who, when was it authored? Who's the organization responsible for it? Here's how you request that information, an agreement that we'd all implement it. And I think it's pretty significant, but it's kind of a footnote in the Argonaut kind of world, is that instead of kind of continuing to roll our own guide, we built this Argonaut DS22 guide, became the de facto standard across the industry, but wasn't kind of a standard. It was just something we published. We kind of partnered with some folks who are working on the ONC US core product and rolled all of our recommendations and kind of an Argonaut developed requirements into that specification. And so when you think of US core, you can think of US core kind of containing all the Argonaut lessons on kind of data query and data access. Clinical data subscriptions first, I first run at that in 2019. And then we had the CURE's final act rule, how exciting, which named, FHIR Release 4, US core, which US core, there's a whole session on US core this afternoon. So, if you're get excited about that later. But then named bulk data export and smart app launch. And then kind of continuing on, a new version of Smart on FHIR was published. So, and that was actually published formally as a standard, and we added some additional content to that. Subscriptions continues to roll. I'll talk more detail about those in a minute. So this is just like one quick slide on our kind of key prior initiatives. And ones I'll talk a little bit more in detail are in bold for you. And what's cool about a lot of these initiatives is there's very detailed talks either freely on the web or for folks who, here at DevDays. Some of them took place yesterday and some are taking place in the future. And so you can, do a little back to the future and watch recordings or get excited about what's coming later today and tomorrow. So first is, of course, Smart on Fire support. So if you missed it yesterday, I think Josh gave 2 different talks on Smart on Fire, which is kind of the de facto standard for access and authentication and access in the HR. So in addition to kind of Argonaut doing that security audit as an initial project, a secondary project was this granular access piece. So instead of kind of these broad scopes of patient or observation access, folks said, hey, observation is kind of a big resource, resource in terms of all the things you can capture with it. It contains social determinants of health information, it contains lab results, smoking status. It's a huge resource, and I know someone in Mark wrote a really sweet paper I saw yesterday about how common the observation resource is profiled and extensions, and it's I don't know what the number was. It was more than 50%. Yeah, so 50% of all profiles between across the FHIR community are on observation and extension. So that's huge. And so the idea is, hey, let's not just give access to a full resource, but let's talk about how we can scope that to say, hey, you're only allowed to see my white blood count, a specific lab test, my CBC results, or maybe something as simple as smoking status, or all vital signs. And so that guidance was kind of pilot tested throughout the year. And then ultimately, again, this is another one that we said, hey, this is important enough to roll it into the standard. And so there was a new update to the Smart on Fire specification. And so the 2.0 release includes what we call granular permissions. And a lot of that is kind of based on is kind of informed by the query, how FHIR supports searching to kind of embed those granular controls as scopes. So check out the Smart on Fire introduction, and also there was an advanced, it's for folks who've seen who missed the advanced section yesterday. I think Josh talked at triple speed and went through all the different Smart on kind of FHIR reference implementations and architecture. And so there's all kinds of cool stuff that I'm sure there's a link to in the Smart on Fire introduction that you need to check out. Okay, data and document query. So this is kind of another, talked about it in a minute, but as being kind of the de facto kind of industry standard for access. Profiling FHIR is actually quite, kind of the mechanics of it are not necessarily challenging, but working through a community of like, hey, what are we going to agree to require on the observation resource, and what terminology we're going to agree is it's a time-consuming process. And then what I think the Argonauts did that was incredibly unique at that time was, hey, we're not going to just talk about, hey, you got to include these elements and you got to use LOINC, but to try to take a step further and say, hey, these are the queries we're all going to support to actually retrieve those resources. For folks who've looked at the FHIR search capabilities at the base FHIR spec, they're so powerful. It's crazy all the things you can do with search. But a lot of the folks that have come to the Argonaut community, they have these legacy data stores. And so they're writing some kind of adapter or piece of middleware over top of that. And so they're not kind of propping up a new FHIR server out of box that just supports all these, the power of FHIR search. They're actually having to go back and, maybe code SQL queries or other things to actually extract that in a way to match that FHIR API. And so the specs actually kind of walk through, and the testing sprints in the beginning were it's kind of funny how comically simple they were, just kind of hitting each other's FHIR servers to make sure that folks supported and returned and just validated the resources to make sure everything is populated. So anyway, the outcomes of this was a publication that you got broad industry adoption, and ultimately I think helped the generation of US core. And so US core is built from Argonaut requirements. We published a lot of versions of US core now. I think you'll see in regulation the version 3.1.1 but there are new versions 4.0 and 5.0. And I think for folks who are doing new development, I think it's important to look at some of the newer versions because we've had to tweak things throughout the process. And if you've heard the two, I don't know, you talk about like 4-letter words, but the word must support, if it doesn't make you like twinge a little bit, you haven't spent much time in standards development of HL7. But the definition basically of like what, we flag these fields in the spec to say, hey, you must support these. And we went through, I think in the very beginning of must support, we said, hey, if you support it, that'd be great. We expect you to support it. And what we learned is, hey, guess what? If you put that, we got off a few phone calls and the light bulb went off that, some folks were hearing, oh, I don't support that. I'm never going to support that. Maybe we will, but it's must support and that's actually optional. So we're okay. We're okay. And when ONC certification program came along and tried to implement that, we're okay, but we don't actually support that field. That was not a popular definition that was going to survive. And so it actually morphed into like, if we flag it in must support, you have to prove your system can actually capture it and it's available for retrieval. And it was interesting. And then we actually, as from the 3.1.1 release on, we actually did a whole sweep through all of the profiles, updated the definition in crazy detail, and then had to make some changes because some vendors truly weren't going to support pieces. And not all the participants, some folks missed some of those updates. And so there was, anyway, it's a giant negotiation to develop these standards and a big process. But in the end, we have US Core. And it's become kind of a de facto baseline standard in the US marketplace. And there is a talk this afternoon on that. Oh, CDS hooks, clinical decision supports at the point of care is such a cool product. And it started outside of Argonaut and, the Argonaut community picked it up and tested on it. The idea of getting information to the clinician at the time they need it. And, Argonaut's role in this was kind of supporting the march to actually balloting it, providing some kind of like background quick start material to the spec. And maybe just take a quick word, the CDS hooks, if you're brand new to CDS hooks, you'll see this picture in many places. I'm even forgetting who drafted this originally. But the idea that, Josh raised his hand. Yeah, of course. It's a good picture. It's very simple. Providers placing a medication order, triggers a call to a remote service. That remote service actually has the capability to kind of reach back into the EHR or FHIR data store to collect additional information to make an informed decision and return that back to the user in a form of information, three types of cards. An information card, which is just text that tells them something. A suggestion card, which actually can have an action in it to actually switch to a different medication. And that switch could be, maybe a clinical decision. It could be a decision on cost. It could be all kinds of things that was, in that rules engine that brought it back. Or it could be a smart app launch. So you can then launch into a application that maybe then collects additional information or kind of takes you down to a new workflow. So there's tons of power in kind of the CDS hooks infrastructure. And so there's a release publication of this 1.0, but the work continues. And there's a sandbox that goes with it. Whenever I see a sandbox, I kind of get this big, personally, I get this big smile. Because for folks who know sandbox, you build a sandbox to match the spec, and then you test with people, and you think, life's pretty good. And some standards in the past were written without sandboxes, and I was convinced that sandboxes mattered, but I don't know, maybe it wasn't fully. It sounds silly now to say this is like 5 years ago, like how sold I am on it now. But we're all at a Connectathon. There's for the folks who don't know HL7 Connectathons, the way they will be in September again is 8 to 10, and this particular track always has you had 30, 40 people around the table. And a few folks, Isaac and Kevin Shackleton, we made a change to an element name. And we made the change 3 or 4 months back. The spec was published, it was live. And the person who did the reference implementation or sandbox hadn't made the change yet. No big deal. It's just, it's Connectathon time. And all of a sudden that's Connectathon, he was doing some new development and he made the change. And all of a sudden there's this collective groan around the table because everyone's implementation broke. And then I was like, wow, what do you mean broken? It's like, oh, we were coding to the sandbox. And so, so the rule is if you've written it down and you haven't written some code that people can test against, you don't actually, you gotta prove it works, but you writing the sandbox actually isn't just enough. It's actually having outside people test it with you to make sure it's a legit sandbox and a legit representation of the standard. And from that point forward, I'm sold, we got to build sandboxes all the time and get people to test against them and keep them up to date. So, and Brandon gave a talk yesterday on CDS hooks. Okay, bulk. Whew. How do we get population level data access? These individual FHIR API queries are great, but if I need to get 1,000 patients, I can't ask 1,000 times, 1,000 times for patients and observations and everything. The FHIR servers are going to, EHRs are going to destroy me. And so there was an effort to build the bulk data specification. And so the idea of, how do you extract a cohort for a research use case or clinical quality improvement use case. A really fun use case for this that I hadn't expected was in the value-based payment or care space, the idea of, you're taking care of a cohort of patients. And so you want to exchange hey, we're responsible for this whole group of patients. We want to pass that along, and then we want to get the data associated with that to make sure that the appropriate care is being provided. This spec has had loads of testing. Dan Gottlieb gave a few talks yesterday and some new updates on it. I think this is one, of course, it's going to be widely adopted. It was in the last regulation, so that helps. And Dan gave a talk on kind of what's new in V2 yesterday. So if you missed it, check it out on Everything's Recorded. It's great. Subscriptions. Oh, this is so, some of these projects we did at one time and then we kind of pick up, and, another kind of unique thing about Argonaut is we really try hard to finish things in a year. And it's kind of arbitrary, and it's probably not always the best choice. But the idea is you gotta put a stake in the ground to say we built something and we're just going to set it down, and maybe we'll come back to it, but you gotta have a target where you've done it. And subscriptions is one that we just keep picking back up. And so the idea of tell me what changes is the whole kind of subscription framework. Gino gave a killer talk yesterday on this. I think the idea of this project, adding subscription topping status as new resources instead of relying on the underlying kind of stringing together a whole bunch of FHIR search, query to make it happen was a really hard decision to make. I say hard, but it probably seems easy now. But at the time, it was a big decision to create a FHIR resource to do this. Why do we need a resource to do this? Another FHIR resource. There's all these conversations that happen. But what was really neat is, so the decision was made, but it was we'll put in R5, and folks are well, when's FHIR R5 coming out? Does anybody know when FHIR R5 is coming out? Well, no one knows when FHIR R5 is coming out. So all of a sudden it's let's get it in this thing called R4B. Let's get it back to FHIR R4, because folks, it's if we're honest with ourselves, DSU2 was the initial baseline. FHIR R4 is going to be super sticky. It is going to be hard to move off FHIR R4. I don't want to say we're going to get stuck there. I don't want to say it's version 2.5. or 2.3 for some of us. It's going to be the one that we get stuck at. I shouldn't say we're going to get stuck at. It's going to be hard to move on because there's so much functionality being built on that. So anyway, a lot of work was done to backport this to R4. R4 is going to be rolled across the industry. You're going to see every FHIR server in the US marketplace who's certified supporting that. Not subscriptions necessarily yet. We're optimistic that will come, but in terms of data access, that's coming later this year on FHIR R4. And check out Gina's talk yesterday. It's fantastic. Okay. Whew. All right, that was the background. Let's talk about the future, where we headed. So we do this fun thing, and this is a little bit busy slide, but we'll tuck into this. Is at the end of the year, we start to gather feedback of, hey, folks, what do you want to do next year? And I inevitably get, Mickey Chabrathi was the Argonaut project manager before, and, as he ran to national coordinator, said, threw out the door and said, hey, we started to collect projects. Here's a list of 25 we should consider and some from last year, and good luck. And so and he did more than that. He's fantastic. The idea is there's always more we want to do, right? It's always hard to decide, like, how do we focus our efforts? Because even if you go back to that list of membership of the Argonaut community, we all have different customers, different priorities, and trying to merge those together into useful projects is a really tricky thing. So we got down to 19 projects we actually discussed in detail. And then we said, hey, you're going to pitch your projects. So if you want to do this project, you got to create 2 slides. And creating 2 slides took the number from 19 projects down to 10. So if you're having trouble prioritization for slide creation, and so, you know, we've launched a few this year, and I'll look at timelines here. But one of the things we're still kind of promoting subscriptions, and I just want to leave this on here, say we're not kind of promoting any formal HL7 ballots for folks from the HL7 community this particular year. So here's a crude timeline that was made actually during one of the calls that has stuck. And the idea is we have what we call above the line projects, like big projects, and then below the line projects. And I sometimes think, like, was this a very creative, you know, did we overthink on the call? Like, oh, maybe we can do more than 3 projects. Because normally we think, 2 to 3 projects. So you can see we grew how many projects we're doing, but then we tried to shrink them down. And so far, I think it's going quite well. So the first one is EHI export to kind of provide a wrapper around how you make that electronic health information request. I'll talk a little about that. Exchanging something called app state in a FHIR right use case. And then later this year, we'll kick off smart health links. So those are what we're calling big projects, 6 months. Some may carry a little longer, but the goal is those are kind of our big focus ones. Below the line, we did something called FHIR endpoint and structure. I'll talk about that in a minute. Of, you know, how do you, every EHR is required to post their FHIR endpoints for their customers. There's no requirement on the standards to do that. We've seen some variety. International patient access is this is a great example. It's an active project out there. The membership of Argonaut said it's a great project. We should get this to publication. And so we're just digging into that right now. And so, you know, when you think of US Core being a US standard for clinical access, this is kind of internationalizing that API request and some of the content that goes with it. And so we're going to provide some support for that. And then, you know, ONC is going to publish US CDI this summer, we hope, July, and we'll do some design sessions on that because we found that to be incredibly productive in terms of creating kind of the initial requirements and coverage. It's forecasted like coverage could be a part of that, and who knows? You never know. It's an exciting day when that comes out. Christmas in July. Okay, so sorry. This is you're gonna see some really busy slides because as I was like trying to think through, like, how do I talk? Because I want to get folks a little bit in the head of the Argonaut community. I don't think anyone's gonna mind, but I took the pitch slides that people provided and thought, well, you know, but we gave folks a little bit of format. So this is a lot of content, but here we go. So the first question is like, what problem are you trying to solve and for whom? And then the kind of secondary question, like, if we don't do this project, like, what happens? This is like, and so for folks who aren't familiar with the electronic health information export, so just ignore the API portion for a moment. Your provider is required to provide you your record under the HIPAA. I won't know the exact regulation, but you can go request your record in the US market. And the idea is the kind of the future regulatory requirements is that you're not going to just get it in some paper format. You're actually going to get it in a computable format. Okay. Now ONC initially started with, the US CDI is the initial requirement, and then it's growing to everything is electronic. Now there's no standardization of that format. So you're going to get all this data, a schema file to go with it, and it's going to vary by every EHR. And that's okay, right? That's a start, just, give us our data and, folks will figure out. And that's going to be in effect across all EHRs end of next year. There's no API component around that, right? So the way that request could be done through a patient portal. It could be by a patient form. One of the first parts of this project that I thought was actually wicked fun was we just started to go down to different health systems and download their, like, how do you access your records today? And then we actually contacted a few of the health information management groups to be like, how hard is this for you? it's really hard for them right now in terms of how to collect the data. You know, they 50 systems, teams of people, specialized vendor products to support this. It's a complex issue to collect all this information. And it was funny, the feedback was actually, for many, was like the EHR is actually the easier part of this problem. So I do think there's going to be a little bit of a tail of complexity on this in terms of like how to collect all those other, but they're working on that now, some of the more advanced health systems. So the idea, you know, so this was selected as a project. There is a proposal out there. This, you know, so then we had two more questions, like who needs to participate? What does success look like? This is one, you know, is really important to have EHR participation, some public sector input, with the end success being kind of a rock solid API to test. We did do, there are kind of two parts to this project, actually. We did do a little bit of work in the fall last year to just kind of survey how the EHRs were approaching the EHI export. And we got a huge bit of variability. And because we originally thought, could we do a little bit of content standardization, or could, you know, is it just going to be the API piece? And we learned that the content standardization is going to be very hard. And, you know, because the US CDI, and I call it US CDI, is the US core data for interoperability. It's a set of data classes and elements that ONC publishes. And it's things that you probably would pick right up, you know, the patient, problems, allergies, lab observations. It's something that ONC plans to grow yearly. And so the idea that, and those are highly curated, and that's where the US core standard gives explicit guidance on how to access that within the API. EHI is that plus everything else. And so there was a decision kind of made last fall, like standardizing all the content is going to be more than we can do in a short period of time. And so it kind of shifted to the API. Anyway, there's a draft specification. Dan Gottlieb led this brilliantly. There was some testing of this. It was funny, as we got to the spot at the end of the project, we looked around and said, like, who's ready to test? Like, you know, who's done development? And this is one of those projects that it was folks said, hey, we have a lot of regulatory requirements right now, and we have a lot of interest in this, but can we wait a little bit? And so this is an example of, we have a draft spec out there. We feel pretty good about it, but we don't know. And so until we do some testing. And so we've kicked off some of the testing of this to fall or possibly winter later this year. Okay, the next one, patient-generated health data. There's not a lot of that out there, is there? Is there, what's going on? So we had an Argonaut agreed last, so, you know, what's problem we're trying to solve? How do you enable patients to share data with the providers? Is there existing solutions here? Apple and Google have done some work in this space. And but it started, Argonaut actually did a project a year ago on FHIR Right. And we started the project saying, hey, we're going to agree, we're going to develop the exact use case as part of the project, okay? And guess what? There's a lot of data people want to write to the EHR. And a big part of the year was trying to prioritize exactly which use case we would do. And we struggled. And so we wrote a few kind of key principles on Right. And this is 2021. And we got to the end and went, man, this wasn't as far as we thought we'd get. And so for 2022, we said, we're not doing just broad patient-generated health data. We have to be very specific. And so you'll see, you know, this was the initial pitch of like, hey, let's look at candidates of, you know, maybe we just pick blood pressure. That'll be simple. And ultimately, you know, we said, hey, there's some industry activity. Apple's done some neat work in terms of kind of persisting app state. So, you know, you have your medical record on your phone and actually being able to share that with your providers, the way to write a bit of information into the EHR's FHIR server. And then the EHR has kind of a companion app that can open and access that to see your medical record. Okay. And that hadn't been standardized, but Apple then rolled it out with, you know, 4 or 5 EHR vendors in the community. And we thought, you know what, rather than dig into some of the complexities of Right, let's nail this app state piece, and then that can grow. So if we can share, you know, a view into the patient's record, and we want to say, hey, let's write that particular data, then we can grow into kind of additional Right use cases. And so, you know, Josh led this, and we have a really nice specification out there and have had good participation from a variety of folks, including the Commons Project and Apple and other EHRs. And so we'll see where this ends up later this year. Endpoint and structure. let's not all publish our endpoint structure in our own way. Let's agree to a common way to do this. And so, some vendors have flat files. A few vendors actually did use the FHIR endpoint resource. Some vendors I couldn't figure out how to download from their websites. They're there. They're not easily accessible. And so there are obviously existing, they're kind of existing approaches, but there wasn't kind of an existing solution for all of us to do it in a common way. And so this kicked off right away. I think this kicked off late February with the idea that at the end, everyone would follow the specification and publish their endpoint structure in a common way. And so a spec was actually, collaboratively developed in April and published in May. And this is when we said, I think actually the end of April, we said, you know what? It's good enough. Who wants to test with us? And it's one of those funny things. Like, if you ask someone, can you test in 2 weeks? They say no. But if you say, how about 6 weeks? They say sure. A little additional time, but making that future promise sometimes. And actually, last week we had about a dozen folks on the phone who'd actually we had a few servers who had actually built this new format. Put some examples in, and a few clients on the phone to actually try to access and download it. The thing that's been really interesting about this FHIR endpoint structure is that was a big light bulb for me is, and this is where, the name Patient Access Brands, it's kind of a funny name for a FHIR endpoint structure. But as a patient, you don't go look for your FHIR endpoint structure, you look for like the brand of your health system. And so you want to see like the logo that goes with their health. Like if you're trying to download your medical record data and you're like looking in some new fangled app, you want to see the logo of your healthcare institution. You can't say Mercy because there's about, you should Google Mercy Healthcare, so many there are in the country. But one person had, a dozen customers in Mercy in a small area. And so the idea that you got to have the logo that goes with that. And so, stitching that together, I think this is there were a few major players out of the gate on this one. We may do another testing effort later this year. Maybe this will become a standard HL7. I'm not sure. We'll let it sit out there, but there's momentum to have folks actually publish in a standard way. And I reached out to the Lantern team. Jeff Brown's up here and other folks from the MITRE organization, so Lantern is a tool that kind of looks across the industry and collects all the FHIR endpoints and does some kind of cool reporting. And the idea is this specification, this format would be something that they'd be able to ingest in the end. Okay, smart ELF links. Oh, this is a big one. This is an exciting one. QR code. What problem are we trying to solve? All right, the problem we're trying to solve is share any health record by presenting a QR code. Whether this is those forms, that pesky forms you fill out before a visit, maybe you have those stored somewhere and you can show a QR code which someone could download. There's a million use cases for this. And I'm just going to say Josh is going to give you a great design discussion on this tomorrow. But share lab results. But yeah, the idea is enabling access to your record through a QR code. And there's additional security and things you can do around it, but it's a new pathway to share information. Argonaut loves international patient access. Standardized international access. And it's been super neat to see the Nordic countries, Epic, others dig in to make this specification a reality. Testing, this is a tricky one. How do you test an international spec when everyone wants to localize it to their own country? Right? It's a fun challenge. And it's also fun that, some countries, including the US market, like we're ahead of the international, it's funny, you have the baseline FHIR specification, all these resources, but then to use it in your market, you have to specialize it. Well, how do you get everyone to step back to say, all right, so what of the huge FHIR standard is going to be the international piece? And so there's actually a really great website within the HL7 Confluence page, for folks who haven't found it. There's a Confluence page as you list content. The team did some really neat analysis of all the kind of international guides and what they support and how that could roll into the IPA. Oh, this is a fun one. Thanks, Gino. Long-term support. You guys have done all this work in the past. How are you going to keep supporting it? So we made an agreement, and it's actually great to do office hours this year, okay? And we are starting office hours next week. And what office hours is not just a time for you to come and ask questions, but it's a reminder to us to maintain the things we've built. And actually also I say that, and I'm a little bit tongue in cheek in that, to get feedback on what people are actually using. So we're not just like refreshing the tool for fun, because our job, we don't see our job as just keeping these tools up to date for, like, we want to know like what additional things people are asking for. So starting next week, we're going to do US core, then we're going to do subscriptions in July, patient list in August. And if this is successful, we're going to keep rolling with this. People come and ask good questions. They're 2 hours. It'll be a probably 15, 20-minute hello. And then what have you learned using this specification? And we'll talk about where to go. All right. I've 4 minutes. So that was a lot, right? We have all these initiatives. We have all this new stuff. Like, what do I do with this? So Argonaut, we're a community, and at HL7, we're considered an accelerator because we're accelerating the standard. And when you think about Argonaut, you'll hear other accelerators. You'll hear DaVinci, you'll hear, you know, on payers, Karen, patient access, all these cool projects. And when I reflect on Argonaut, I apologize for this picture, but I think of it as like foundational efforts. Like, how do we enable a whole variety of use cases? And I apologize for the pictures. This was my backyard like last week. I was having a patio party and I was like, oh, and I took the picture and I was like, oh, maybe work this in. But the idea that a lot goes into a good foundation. So if you've ever seen like a sidewalk pour or something that's built, it's not, you know, you walk over it and you don't even think about all that's underneath it, okay? And unfortunately, just some pictures I take throughout the project is like, you know, they had to run electrical wire. I ran electrical wire, you know, conduit underneath to mount. There's 3 to 4 inches of gravel in there to make sure it's packed down for good. There's a footing, a 48-inch footing. Anyone know what state I live in? You know, you got to go down 4 feet for the frost line, all right? So Minnesota, okay? Because otherwise it shifts up. You got rebar like crazy. There's a grounding, like who thinks about a grounding wire in the middle of the thing? So there's a lot that goes into pouring a good, there's a pitch to the drain. Like, you know, this is not an area that has a good drain spot. So there's a lot that goes into a simple concrete foundation. And when I think about the Argonaut projects, like you know, we're not perfect in that we don't have, you know, 100 years of pouring concrete, but we're trying to learn and make sure we have good foundation for other activities for folks to build on top of. We love participation. Zulip channel is the best way to contact any of us. Gino, Dan, Eric, or Josh. We all love new folks testing our work. And we want you. We're all a weird community. And let's, you know, join and play the band together. And yeah, hope you have a good time at DevDays. And I left a minute for questions. What's that? Yeah. My nickname was Big Bird in college. So awesome. All right.